September 1945, Yokohama Harbor. Rain drifted lightly across the broken docks where burned cargo cranes leaned over the water like twisted skeletons. Beyond the shoreline, rows of temporary Allied tents stretched across the muddy ground beside stacks of ration crates marked with American lettering. The war had ended only weeks earlier, but the silence inside the holding compound still carried the weight of surrender. Several Japanese women stood near the wire fence, wrapped in faded uniforms and civilian coats patched from old fabric. Most avoided eye contact with the occupation troops moving through the camp. Then, from across the yard came something unexpected: laughter. Inside an American mess area, men and women in uniform sat together at the same tables. They passed trays between one another. Some smoked cigarettes while eating. One woman leaned back in her chair as an officer beside her laughed openly at something she said. The Japanese prisoners stared without speaking. For many of them, the scene felt more unsettling than the soldiers themselves. And in that quiet moment beside the ruins of defeat, an entire world of assumptions began to fracture. Long before American occupation troops arrived in Japan, the country had already spent more than a decade reshaping everyday life around discipline, obedience, and sacrifice. By the late 1930s, Imperial Japan was no longer simply a nation at war. It had become a society organized around war itself. Children in schools bowed toward the imperial palace each morning. Newspapers praised military death as honorable. Radios carried reports from China and the Pacific framed as proof of Japanese destiny. Loyalty to the emperor stood above individuality, and social behavior reflected that hierarchy in almost every public space. For women, expectations were especially rigid. The ideal promoted by the government was built around silence, restraint, and duty. Women were expected to support the empire through service to family, factory work, or nursing roles that remained firmly subordinate to male authority. Public interaction between unrelated men and women was restrained by custom and class expectations, particularly among conservative and military circles. Formality mattered constantly: how one sat, spoke, bowed, or even shared meals. Inside the military structure itself, hierarchy was absolute. Junior officers avoided casual behavior around superiors. Enlisted men rarely relaxed openly in formal settings. Emotional control became part of national identity. To many Japanese citizens raised during this era, Western social openness appeared disorderly, weak, or morally dangerous. State propaganda reinforced those beliefs relentlessly. American culture was often portrayed as selfish and decadent. Western women were described in wartime publications as lacking discipline and modesty. Japanese civilians were taught that enemy societies had grown spiritually weak through luxury and individual freedom. By 1945, many genuinely believed that the United States lacked the moral unity needed to endure hardship. Then came August. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki shattered entire cities within seconds. Soviet forces stormed into Manchuria. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito addressed the nation by radio and announced Japan's surrender. For millions listening in stunned silence, the voice of the emperor did not sound triumphant or divine. It sounded human. And within weeks, occupation troops began entering a country whose deepest certainties had already started to collapse. When Allied forces began arriving in Japan after the surrender, many civilians expected violence, humiliation, or revenge. Years of wartime propaganda had painted the Americans as brutal occupiers who would destroy Japanese society the moment they landed ashore. Some families hid valuables beneath floorboards. Others warned daughters not to look directly at foreign soldiers. In rural towns, rumors spread faster than official information, but the occupation unfolded differently than many had imagined. Under the command of Douglas MacArthur, American forces moved quickly to stabilize ports, rail lines, and food distribution centers. Japan's infrastructure had been devastated by bombing. Entire districts of Tokyo, Osaka, and Yokohama remained blackened ruins. Millions faced shortages of rice, medicine, fuel, and clean water. Long queues formed outside ration stations every morning, while demobilized soldiers wandered home through cities they barely recognized. Alongside combat veterans came something unfamiliar to much of the Japanese population. American women in uniform, nurses from the Army Nurse Corps, worked inside occupation hospitals treating civilians and former enemy personnel alike. Clerks and translators from the Women's Army Corps moved through headquarters buildings carrying documents, speaking directly with officers, and organizing logistics operations. Red Cross workers appeared in camps and transport stations handing out food, cigarettes, and medical supplies. To many Japanese observers, the behavior of these women seemed almost impossible to understand. American servicewomen spoke casually with male soldiers in public. They shared transportation, meals, and workspaces. Some smoked openly. Others laughed loudly. Crowded mess halls without apparent concern for rank or ceremony. Even small gestures, sitting beside men, making eye contact while speaking, addressing officers without visible fear carried enormous cultural weight to people raised inside Imperial Japan's rigid, wartime structure. Inside temporary detention centers and processing compounds across Japan and former occupied territories, defeated Japanese personnel watched these interactions closely. Some, women who had served as nurses, communications workers, or auxiliary staff during the war, found themselves studying the Americans in silence, trying to reconcile propaganda with reality. The shock did not come from one dramatic event. It emerged slowly through ordinary moments. Trays of food passed across tables, conversations between men and women spoken as equals, laughter echoing through camps, built beside the ruins of a defeated empire. And for many prisoners, those quiet observations became impossible to forget. For many Japanese women held in occupation camps or temporary processing centers after the war, the shock did not begin with military power. It began with behavior. In pre-war Japan, meals carried layers of social order. Seating arrangements reflected rank, age, gender, and family position. Formality surrounded even ordinary conversation. Public restraint was considered a sign of dignity and discipline, especially for women. Conservative environments shaped by military influence. Unrelated men and women rarely relaxed together openly. American camps appeared completely different. Mess halls were noisy. Soldiers spoke while eating. Women moved freely between tables, carrying trays beside male servicemen. Some addressed officers directly without lowering their gaze. Others joked openly in front of enlisted men. To Japanese observers raised under strict expectations of silence and hierarchy, the scene felt deeply disorienting. Several occupation-era accounts describe Japanese civilians staring at American dining areas for long periods without speaking. What disturbed them was not indecency in a literal sense. It was the absence of visible social barriers. The Americans appeared unconcerned with the rules that had governed Japanese life for generations, and yet the camp remained orderly. That contradiction unsettled many prisoners more than propaganda ever had. Throughout the Pacific War, Imperial Japanese media carefully constructed an image of the West designed to strengthen obedience at home. American society was portrayed as spiritually weak, corrupted by material comfort and individualism. Newspapers and military publications often described Western women as lacking modesty, discipline, and national loyalty. The message served an important purpose. If Japan's enemy could be depicted as morally inferior, then sacrifice became easier to justify. Hunger, battlefield losses, and civilian hardship could all be endured in the name of preserving a supposedly superior national spirit. By 1944, as bombing raids intensified and defeat became increasingly likely, propaganda grew even more extreme. But surrender forced direct contact with the people behind those images. Japanese detainees encountered American nurses working long shifts inside overcrowded hospitals. They saw female clerks organizing military logistics with efficiency and authority. In Some camps, women distributed food to prisoners while male soldiers stood nearby, speaking casually beside them. The reality did not match the warnings they had heard for years. Many prisoners expected cruelty from occupation troops. Instead, they witnessed routine, cooperation between men and women functioning without visible disorder. The enemy, society they had been taught to despise, suddenly appeared stable, confident, and strangely ordinary. For some, that realization created confusion more powerful than fear. Before 1945, large numbers of Japanese civilians had never seen women serving openly inside military structures the way Americans did during the war. The United States had mobilized hundreds of thousands of women through organizations such as the Women's Army Corps and the Navy Waves program. Female nurses operated near combat zones across the Pacific. Women handled communications, intelligence work, administration, transport coordination, and medical support on an enormous scale. In occupation Japan, their presence became impossible to ignore. American servicewomen walked through ports carrying paperwork beside male officers. They drove military vehicles through shattered city streets. Inside headquarters buildings, translators watched women participate in briefings once reserved entirely for men in Japanese military culture. To defeated Japanese personnel, the image challenged deeply rooted assumptions about authority itself. Some women prisoners reportedly became fascinated by the confidence American servicewomen displayed in public spaces. They watched how female nurses spoke directly to surgeons, how clerks exchanged instructions with officers, and how conversations flowed without rigid ceremony. These interactions seemed less like acts of rebellion and more like normal daily life. And inside the silence of the camps, many prisoners slowly began comparing that reality to the world they had just lost. By the autumn of 1945, exhaustion hung over Japan like smoke. Cities had burned for months beneath American bombing raids. Millions were homeless. Soldiers returned from China, Burma, and Pacific Islands carrying malaria, malnutrition, and silence. Families searched train stations for relatives who would never come home. Across the country, defeat had already destroyed the physical structure of the empire. But inside prisoner compounds and occupation zones, another collapse was unfolding more quietly. For many Japanese women connected to wartime service, nurses, clerks, communications workers, factory personnel, ordinary encounters with Americans began eroding beliefs that had once seemed permanent. The shock often arrived through details so small they would have appeared meaningless before the war. A woman smoking beside a male officer, an enlisted serviceman laughing in front of a superior, a nurse speaking casually while eating at the same table as men. Under Imperial Japan's wartime culture, hierarchy shaped nearly every public interaction. Respect flowed downward through visible rituals of obedience. Emotional restraint signaled moral strength. But the Americans seemed to function differently. Discipline existed, yet it appeared separated from fear. That contradiction disturbed many observers profoundly. Some prisoners later recalled feeling unable to understand how an army could remain effective while allowing such informal behavior. Others became aware of something more unsettling, the possibility that their own society had not been as invincible or morally superior as they had been taught. And once doubt entered the mind, it spread quickly through the ruins of surrender. During the war, distance had made hatred easier. Most Japanese civilians knew Americans only through propaganda posters, radio, broadcasts, or stories carried home from the battlefield. The enemy existed as an abstract, force dropping bombs from the sky. But occupation placed former enemies face to face, inside hospitals, camps, kitchens, and supply stations. The effect was gradual but powerful. American medics treated wounded Japanese civilians alongside occupation personnel. Food distribution centers handed out powdered milk, canned goods, and medicine to starving. Families in detention compounds, guards sometimes exchanged cigarettes or brief conversations with prisoners through translators. These moments did not erase bitterness or humiliation. Many Japanese civilians still viewed the occupation with anger and grief. but repeated exposure to ordinary behavior slowly weakened the absolute image of the enemy created during wartime. For women prisoners especially, shared meals became strangely symbolic. Eating together suggested trust. It implied social equality, at least within that space. Women raised under rigid expectations of deference and separation watching American men and women casually share tables challenged assumptions they had carried since childhood. Some prisoners remained deeply uncomfortable with what they saw. Others became curious. A few quietly admired the confidence displayed by American servicewomen moving through military spaces without visible hesitation. The enemy no longer appeared distant or mythical. They looked human. History often remembers wars through explosions, speeches, and surrender ceremonies. But societies can also change through quieter moments, almost invisible at the time. A crowded mess hall, a conversation without formal rank, a woman speaking freely in public. For many Japanese observers after 1945, these scenes carried enormous psychological force because they revealed an alternative social order functioning in real time. Americans were not behaving casually because discipline had collapsed. They behaved that way because their culture allowed forms of personal freedom that wartime Japan had discouraged or condemned. That realization became deeply influential during the occupation years. Under Allied reforms, Japan soon introduced women's suffrage, changes in labor law, and educational restructuring that weakened older authoritarian systems. None of those transformations happened simply because prisoners watched Americans eat together. But the visual shock of those early encounters mattered more than official declarations. People remember what they see, and in the devastated months after surrender, thousands of Japanese civilians and detainees witnessed men and women interacting publicly in ways they had once been taught would destroy social order. Yet the world around them did not collapse. Instead, the old certainties collapsed first, and inside one occupation camp after another, a defeated nation began confronting the possibility that its future might look nothing like its past. October 1945, near Yokohama, cold wind moved through the canvas walls of a temporary occupation compound built beside a damaged freight yard. The nearby rail line still carried burned-out train cars from the final months of the war, and piles of twisted steel remained stacked near the harbor, where American engineers were clearing debris from the docks. Inside the compound, several Japanese women waited near a registration building after morning processing. Most had served in auxiliary wartime roles: nurses, office workers, radio assistants, or support personnel attached to military facilities during the final years of the conflict. They stood quietly together beneath gray skies, speaking only in short whispers. Then the lunch bell sounded across the camp. American servicemen began moving toward a large mess tent near the center of the compound. A few minutes later, women in uniform joined them carrying trays and metal cups. Some wore Army nurse insignia. Others belonged to clerical or communications units, assigned to occupation headquarters nearby. The Japanese detainees watched carefully. No separate entrance existed for the women. No guarded partition divided the tables. Men and women entered the same crowded tent together, talking as they walked. One female clerk reached across table and casually removed a cigarette pack from beside a male sergeant's tray while laughing at something he said. Nearby, a nurse sat beside two officers discussing paperwork while eating from the same line of rations as everyone else. The scene seemed almost unreal. Under the wartime culture, many of the prisoners had known even small interactions between unrelated men and women carried layers of formality and restraint. Public familiarity could invite criticism or shame. Yet here, inside the camp of a victorious foreign army, women moved through military space without visible hesitation. More confusing still, the men accepted it naturally. Nobody appeared shocked. No officer corrected the behavior. Rank remained visible through uniforms and insignia, but the atmosphere lacked the rigid tension common inside Imperial Japanese military environments. The Americans joked openly while eating. Some leaned back in their chairs. Others spoke with food still in their hands. To the prisoners standing outside the mess tent, The disorder should have signaled weakness. Instead, it appeared effortless. One Japanese interpreter later described similar moments during the occupation as psychologically devastating because they forced observers to confront a contradiction propaganda had never prepared them for. The Americans possessed overwhelming military power, yet their society did not resemble the chaotic moral collapse Japanese wartime media had predicted. The prisoners continued, staring through the open tent entrance long after the meal had begun, and slowly among the silence beside the fence line, certainty gave way to something far more dangerous than fear, doubt. The longer the occupation continued, the harder it became for many prisoners to separate reality from the beliefs they had carried through the war. Inside the Yokohama compound, lunch ended the way it had begun, casually. Trays were stacked, cigarettes were exchanged. Several servicemen stepped outside into the cold afternoon air beside female personnel without ceremony or visible concern for appearances. One American nurse unfolded a newspaper while standing beside a corporal near the entrance of the tent. Another woman climbed into the passenger seat of a military truck, already crowded with male soldiers heading toward the docks. The Japanese detainees watched every movement. Some did so with visible discomfort, others with fascination. A few simply stared in silence, unable to reconcile what they were seeing with the world they had once believed permanent. One prisoner reportedly asked an interpreter whether the women inside the American camp were wives. The answer came back almost immediately. Number. They were soldiers, nurses, clerks, drivers, workers, assigned to the occupation itself. For a moment, the explanation seemed to create more confusion rather than clarity. Before the surrender, Japanese wartime authorities had repeatedly described American society as soft and undisciplined. Yet the evidence surrounding the camp suggested the opposite. The United States had crossed the Pacific Ocean, destroyed the Imperial Navy, firebombed Japanese cities, dropped atomic weapons, and occupied the country within weeks of victory. Nothing about the military machinery surrounding the prisoners suggested weakness, and still men and women sat together, laughing over lunch. That contradiction lingered heavily inside the compound. Several former Japanese civilians later recalled that the occupation's greatest psychological impact often came not from direct orders issued by Allied authorities, but from witnessing ordinary American behavior up close. The small freedoms displayed casually by occupation personnel exposed an unfamiliar relationship between authority and daily life. Women spoke openly. Young soldiers addressed officers without visible terror. Conversations flowed without layers of ritual politeness. The Americans still obeyed commands. Guards still carried rifles. Military discipline still existed, but it operated differently than the rigid obedience many Japanese detainees had known since childhood. Gradually, questions began replacing assumptions. Some prisoners asked translators about American schools and workplaces. Others became curious about whether women in the United States could vote, own property, or work outside the home. In certain camps, Japanese civilians quietly practiced English phrases learned from occupation personnel distributing food or medical supplies. The change remained cautious and uneven. Humiliation, anger, and grief still surrounded the surrender. Entire families had vanished beneath bombing raids. Millions faced hunger. Through the winter of 1945, many Japanese citizens deeply resented the occupation and viewed its reforms as foreign intrusion forced upon a defeated nation. But beneath that resentment, another realization was taking shape. The world beyond Imperial Japan had not collapsed from moral weakness. It had won. And for some women, standing behind the wire fences of occupation camps, the simple image of men and women eating together became impossible to forget because it symbolized something larger than cultural difference. It suggested that power itself could exist without the rigid social boundaries they had always been taught were necessary for order. In the months ahead, that unsettling idea would spread far beyond the camps and into the foundations of post-war Japan itself. By the beginning of 1946, the The occupation of Japan had entered a new phase. The fighting was over, but Allied authorities understood that military victory alone would not guarantee stability. Much of the country remained physically shattered. Tokyo's burned. Districts stretched for miles. Industrial production had collapsed. Food shortages grew, severe during the winter, and black markets expanded around nearly every major train station. Yet alongside reconstruction came something equally significant: transformation. Under occupation policies directed through Allied headquarters, Japan began undergoing some of the most rapid social reforms in its modern history. Many changes directly challenged the rigid wartime structure that had shaped Japanese society for decades. For women, the shift was historic. In late 1945, occupation authorities supported legal reforms granting Japanese women the right to vote for the first time. Educational systems emphasizing absolute obedience and militarism were rewritten. Textbooks glorifying sacrifice for the emperor disappeared from classrooms. New labor protections slowly opened opportunities outside traditional expectations of domestic service and wartime support roles. The changes did not arrive smoothly. Conservative officials resisted parts of the reforms. Older generations often viewed Western influence with suspicion or discomfort. In rural areas especially, traditional gender expectations remained deeply rooted despite new laws introduced under occupation supervision. But the visual reality of daily life had already begun changing. American military bases continued exposing Japanese civilians to unfamiliar social behavior. Women worked openly beside men inside occupation offices, hospitals, supply depots, and communication centers. Japanese interpreters, secretaries, and clerical workers hired by Allied authorities observed these interactions closely every day. For many civilians, the occupation became the first sustained contact with women operating publicly inside professional and military structures. Without strict subordination to male authority, the memory stayed powerful because it contrasted so sharply with the final years of the war. Only months earlier, Japan had mobilized women primarily through sacrifice, factory labor, nursing support, rationing, and preparation for national emergency. Now defeated civilians watched foreign women move through positions of responsibility with visible independence and confidence. To some observers, the change felt humiliating. To others, quietly revolutionary. And as occupation reforms spread across schools, workplaces, and government institutions, the psychological shock first experienced inside camps and mess halls slowly expanded into Japanese society itself. As the occupation years continued, the memory of those first encounters with Americans remained deeply complicated for many Japanese civilians. Some remembered humiliation above all else. The empire that had promised eternal strength had collapsed within weeks. Foreign troops now walked through Japanese cities, once taught to fear invasion at any cost. Black market stalls crowded beneath shattered buildings while occupation vehicles rolled past the ruins of burned neighborhoods. But alongside the bitterness, there was also observation. Writers, teachers, translators, and former wartime workers began describing how ordinary American behavior had challenged assumptions they once considered unquestionable. Memoirs and interviews recorded decades later, many recalled less the speeches of occupation officials than the daily scenes repeated across military compounds, train stations, schools, and offices. Women speaking freely in public, men helping clear tables after meals, young Americans arguing openly with superiors without immediate punishment. These details seemed minor from the outside, yet they carried enormous symbolic force. Inside a society emerging from years of rigid militarization, by 1947, Japan's new constitution formally guaranteed legal equality between men and women. Women entered national elections as voters and political candidates. Educational reforms encouraged broader participation in public life. Although traditional expectations remained powerful in practice, the structure of Japanese society had undeniably shifted. Historians still debate how deeply these transformations emerged from occupation pressure versus internal Japanese change already underway before surrender. Many reforms, introduced by Allied authorities, faced resistance and evolved unevenly over time. Post-war, Japan did not suddenly abandon its traditions, nor did American influence erase older cultural values. But the occupation accelerated encounters that could no longer be reversed. Millions of Japanese citizens witnessed alternative social systems functioning directly in front of them during a moment of national collapse. The experience forced comparisons that propaganda had once prevented. Even critics of the occupation often acknowledged that exposure to American society revealed possibilities previously unimaginable under wartime rule for women who had lived through the final years of Imperial Japan. Those early impressions remained especially vivid, not because they immediately embraced everything they saw, but because the scenes felt so startlingly ordinary. A cafeteria table, a conversation without fear, a woman in uniform laughing beside male soldiers, while the machinery of the world's most powerful military surrounded them. In another time, the moment might have passed unnoticed, but in defeated Japan, amid hunger, ruins, and the silence after surrender, it became part of a much larger realization. The old order had not simply lost a war, it had lost its certainty. Wars are often remembered through explosions, surrender ceremonies, and the movements of armies across maps. But history also changes through moments so quiet that almost nobody notices them at the time. A shared meal, a casual conversation, a woman sitting beside men without fear or apology. In the autumn of 1945, countless Japanese civilians and prisoners encountered scenes that challenged beliefs shaped over an entire lifetime. Many had been taught that strict hierarchy protected civilization itself, that discipline required distance, silence, and obedience. Yet, the victorious foreign soldiers occupying their country behaved differently. Their society appeared less rigid, but no less powerful. That contradiction lingered long after the camps disappeared. The occupation of Japan would remain controversial in many ways, and the scars of war never truly faded from those who survived it. Entire cities had vanished beneath firestorms. Millions carried grief that no reform could erase. But amid the devastation, ordinary human behavior became part of a larger transformation unfolding across post-war Japan. Not through speeches alone, through observation. Because sometimes the collapse of an old world begins not when people are forced to abandon their beliefs, but when they quietly witness another way of living, standing directly in front of them. And for some Japanese women after World War II, the memory that stayed with them was not the sound of gunfire or surrender broadcasts. It was the sight of men and women eating together beneath the lights of an American mess hall while the ruins of an empire waited silently outside.